This is Pamela Lynn Kolthauser, reporter for the Abolition News Network, broadcasting live March 10, 1770, at the National Martyrs Mausoleum. Today we are going to talk to the first American martyr of the colonies about an event known around the world as the Boston Massacre. Please welcome Crispus Attucks. Welcome, Mr. Attucks.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's just start. So now, why don't you describe to us in detail the events that took place on March 5th, 1770 on King Street in downtown Boston?
Well, it was a cold, moonlit night. There was about a foot of snow on the ground, and all of a sudden, a church bell rang out. And then, shortly after that, a rumor was spread that a barber was being abused by some British sentries, and a angry crowd grew in the streets of Boston. So I grabbed my corkwood stick and I went out and I said, we're going to keep the peace. I wanted to keep the peace and no one was going to fight.
Okay. Well, before you go on with the story, what do you think the people of Boston, just an ordinary citizen, how did they feel about British rule, or even the Boston girls dating the British soldiers?
We don't like it. We don't like them dating our girls. We just don't like them lobster backs. They're just not, it's just horrible. And now we're like a garrison town with the British troops having unchecked power.
Okay. So who ended up firing the first shot that night?
It happened so fast. It was about 9 o'clock and a brick was thrown. And one of the British sentries, he was stepping back and he slipped on a piece of ice. And when he slipped back, he fired up in the air.
Wow. So what happened next?
Well, after that, about 8 British troops from the 29th Regiment, they came and they fired head on towards the crowd. And I was hit first with 2 shots in the chest, and then 2 more were hit after that.
Wow. Can you describe the scene on the streets afterwards?
Well, I don't have to. Paul Revere, he put together this engraving to show exactly what happened. And as you can see, the British troops, they were firing point blank range at us. And it was just horribly bloody. Samuel Adams, he called it the Bloody Butchery.
Wow.
Oh, look what he says. Let me read this. Unhappy Boston, see thy sons deplore. Thy hallowed walks be smeared with guiltless gore.
While faithless Preston and his savage bands with murderous rancors stretch their bloody hands.
Like fierce barbarians grinning over their prey, approve the carnage and enjoy the day.
If seedling drops from rage from anguished wings, if speechless sorrows laboring for a tongue,
or if a weeping world can aught appease the plaintive ghosts of victims such as these.
The patriots' copious tears for each are shed, a glorious tribute which embalms the dead.
But know each summons to that awful goal, where justice strips the murderer of his soul.
Should venal courts, the scandal of the land, snatch the relentless villain from her hand.
Keen execrations, on this plate inscribed, shall reach a judge who never can be bribed.
Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. It says here, the above examples are duplicated by ones from other states, and together they should illustrate the thesis that the term mulatto can only be interpreted as referring to mixed persons with Native American ancestry, being a potential part of the mixture, especially during the periods when Indians are identified as being servants or slaves alongside of Africans. It is apparent that no other terms such as half-breeds or musties are utilized. Mulatto is, therefore, the only legal reference to racially mixed persons of whatever background. At this point, it would be well to note other evidence showing that the mixed African-American people in Massachusetts, dodged the hijack with African, a rather numerous group, were consistently referred to as mulattoes. Again, mulattoes, they were just talking about Indians. Or as people of color. Again, mulattoes or as people of color. Paul Cuffey, the noted half-Indian, half-black mariner and merchant, referred to himself and his relations in petitions as of our color Indian men. Indian men, and all free Negroes and mulattoes. Now, isn't this similarly? Crispus Attucks. We're going to get into Crispus Attucks. I'm going to let you know who he really was. Similarly, Crispus Attucks, who died in Boston Massacre, was a Native American extraction but called a mulatto. He is usually described as a mulatto, but it seems probably that he was a native Indian from Framingham who was also of Negro blood. So he's saying also of Negro. What does he mean by that? We're going to go into it, right?
The classic example is someone like Crispus Attucks. Now, when he runs away from his master, he was an indentured servant and not a slave. When he runs away from his master in Framingham, Massachusetts in 1750, the original newspaper's announcement posting a reward for his return described him as a mulatto fellow, literally. And in 18th century parlance, at least in New England, mulatto means a person of indefinite pigmentation. That indefinite pigmentation could be a result of racial mixing. That's not necessarily the case. That person could be a mixed European Indian, could be a mixed European African, could be an African Indian mixture, or could simply be an Indian person who Europeans assumed had a vague sort of brownish skin color. There's absolutely nothing to imply in that usage that Crispus Attucks is an African. There's absolutely nothing to imply in that usage that Crispus Attucks is an African.
All right, so I'm going to read to you from this book. It's called the American Historical Record, or a scholarly journal, right? This is from the collections of Harvard University, all right? From Harvard University. Again, this is the American Historical Record and Repertory of Notes and Queries concerning the history and antiquities of America and biography of Americans, edited by Benson J. Lawson, 1872, all right? So on page 531 of this book, we read, who was Crispus Attucks? And it says here, the record is indebted to Mr. J.B. Fisher of Philadelphia for the following interesting inquiry concerning the nativity of Crispus Attucks. And I'm going to read here, it says, in Boston on the 5th of March, 1770, a party of men, mostly sailors, marched from Dock Square to State Street, then King Street, and assaulted the guard at the Custom House. This mob was led by a man almost a giant in stature. A giant. This is an aboriginal. In the affray, several of the assailants were killed. Among the killed was the gigantic leader, Crispus Attucks. This has generally been considered as the scene of the first blood shed in the American Revolution. So again, according to Wikipedia, Crispus Attucks, right, it says, was an American stevedore of African Dutch to hijack and Native American descent, widely regarded as the first person killed in the Boston Massacre and thus the first American killed in the American Revolution. The first American, all right, not African American, Crispus Attucks. Historians disagree on whether Crispus Attucks was a free man or an escaped slave. Again, historians disagree. They don't know. They just be making up things, all right? But most agree that he was a Wampanoag. Most agree. They all knew he was a Wampanoag. Again, who did the pilgrims encounter when they arrived? The Wampanoag. And I already showed you who the Wampanoag were, what they looked like. An African descent, it says, thought to hijack. Two major sources of eyewitness testimony about the Boston Massacre, both published in 1770, did not refer to Attucks as black nor as Negro. It appeared that the Bostonians or European descent viewed him as being of mixed ethnicity. According to a contemporary account in the Pennsylvania Gazette, Philadelphia, he was a mulatto man named Crispus Attucks, again mulatto, who was born in Framingham, but lately belonged to New Providence and was here in order to go for North Carolina. Because of his mixed heritage, his story is also significant for Native Americans. He is Aboriginal. Who was Crispus Attucks? By the testimony of the witness given at the trial in November of 1770, he is called the Mulatto. I believe grave doubts can be thrown on this assumption, and that the weight of carefully examined testimony will prove that he was a Massachusetts Indian. Again, he was a Massachusetts Indian. This guy's gonna prove it to you. Are you guys ready? All right. You think I'm just making up things? You see, I'm pulling out another source here, right? From Harvard University. All right. So again, this guy's telling you that this assumption that he was a mulatto, meaning that he was mixed with African, is an assumption, and that it has that the weight of carefully examined testimony will prove that he was a Massachusetts Indian, and that the first life lost in our great revolutionary struggle was that of one of the ancient possessors of the soil of the race which produced a Philip of Mount Hope and other great minds and capable leaders. You hear that? Your ancestor. He was the first hero of the Revolutionary War in the U.S. He was an American native and aboriginal. All right. In the book History of Framingham, Massachusetts, early known as Danforth's Farm, 1640 to 1880, with genealogical register by J.H. Temple. And in this book, we go to page 61. It says here, in the occupation, it says warrant to Edward Michelson, Marshal General. Now they're talking about a warrant sent out for the basically the capture of Captain Tom Indian and a John Attuck Indian, right? And it's basically they framed him for doing something without no proof, without him getting any trial or anything. He says he wasn't there, and basically they hanged him. They executed these two people. So let's read what it says. You are to take notice that the council hath condemned and sentenced Captain Tom Indian and John Attuck Indian, enemies, to be hanged on this day after the lecture till they be dead, which you are to cause and see the executioner to perform his office and execute them accordingly. Dated 22nd of June, 1676, by order of the council. Edward Rawson, Secretary. See that he was framed and murdered. And then it continues, probably John Attuck, who was executed with Captain Tom, was an ancestor, right? John Attuck, an ancestor of Crispus Attucks, a revolutionary fame. We're gonna see who Crispus Attucks is. Most of you probably already know. And yes, that was his ancestor, John Attuck, an Indian. All right, so Crispus Attucks is an Indian as well. This whole Attuck last name, Shattuck and Attuck, is an Indian word, or American Aboriginal word. Okay, so in this journal of the Early Republic, it says volume 29, number 2, from 2009. It says, from forgotten founder to indispensable icon, Crispus Attucks, black citizenship and collective memory dodged a hijack with black. Okay, so it says here, Attucks, of course, lived and died a subject in the British Empire. Despite many biographical treatments and extensive historical investigations, little is known with certainty about his life, so they don't know anything. Attuck's brief appearance in the historical records has stimulated both professional and amateur historians to dig for details. Some evidence has been uncovered, but most is circumstantial, leaving much to speculation. All right, much to speculation, and I'm telling you, the African part is the speculation. The most widely accepted construction of Attuck's life suggests that he was born around 1723 in the town of Natick, a multi-tribal praying town, the praying Indians, of Christianized Indians near Framingham, about 20 miles west of Boston. He was likely of mixed African and Indian ancestry, possibly descended from a man named John Attuck, who was executed in 1676 for his ostensible role in King Philip's War. And we already know that was a fraud. They framed him. All right, so you know the mentality these people are coming from. Crispus Attucks was a large man, over 6 feet tall, and probably enslaved to William Brown of Framingham, until he escaped in 1750, after which, at times using the pseudonym Michael Johnson, he worked as a sailor and around the docks in Boston and elsewhere around the Atlantic Basin, until his fateful role in the events of March 5th, 1770. In this book, called A Retrospect of the Boston Tea Party with a memoir of George R.T. Hughes, a survivor of the little band of patriots who drowned the tea in Boston Harbor. You hear this? So one of the persons who actually threw the tea over. All right, and this was in 1834. All right, so according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, right, online, if you're not familiar with the Boston Tea Party, basically it's written that it was an incident in which 342 chests of tea belonging to the British East India Company were thrown from ships into Boston Harbor by American patriots disguised as Mohawk Indians. Alright, so they dressed up like Indians to blame the Indians, right? The Americans were protesting both a tax on tea, taxation without representation, and the perceived monopoly of the East India Company. Alright. Okay, so back in the book, A Retrospect of the Boston Tea Party with the memoir of George R.T. Hughes. Alright, survivor of the little band of patriots who drowned the tea in Boston Harbor, right? From his own account, one of the persons, right, that dressed up as a Mohawk. It says here that, well, let's go a little bit down. It says, when the committee returned and informed the meeting of the absence of the governor, there was a confused murmur among the members, and the meeting was immediately dissolved. Many of them crying out, let every man do his duty and be true to his country. And there was a general huzzah for Griffin's Wharf. It was now evening, and I immediately dressed myself in the costume of an Indian, equipped with a small hatchet, which I and my associates denominated the tomahawk, which and a club, after having painted my face and hands with coal dust in the shop of a blacksmith. Again, what did he paint his face with? Coal dust. All right, now if you get coal, right, what is going to happen to your face, right? This is like well, this is a coal mask, and this is a coal mask. This is what so this is what they, why would they want to look black? Why, if they want to look like Indians, would they paint themselves black? Right? Why would they paint themselves black if they wanted to look like Indians? Because coal is really dark, right? Now it says he actually writes about the people who got killed during the Boston Tea Party massacre. 3 of our citizens fell dead on the spot, and 2 who were wounded died the next day, and 9 others were also wounded. The persons who were killed I will recollect, said Hughes. They were Gray, a rope maker; Maverick, a young man; Colwell, who was the mate of Captain Colton; and Attuck, a mulatto. They're talking about Crispus Attucks, a mulatto, right? Remember, mulatto. And Carr, who was an Irishman. Captain Preston then immediately fled with his grenadiers back to the guardhouse. Continuing the book of the history of Framingham, it says here, Crispus Attucks, who is admitted to have been the leader of the party, was a mulatto. Remember what Jack Forbes says about mulatto in Africans and Native Americans book. Born near the Framingham town line, a short distance to the eastward of the state arsenal. The old cellar hole where the Attucks family lived is still visible. He was probably a descendant of John Attuck, an Indian. He was, who was taken prisoner and executed at the same time with Captain Tom in June 1676. Probably the family had intermarried with Negroes, who were slaves, and as the offspring of such marriage were held to be slaves. He inherited their condition, although it seems likely that the blood of 3 races coursed through his veins. He had been bought by D. William Brown of Framingham as early as 1747, but he thus early acquired some ideas of the value of manhood and liberty, as appears from the following advertisement in the Boston Gazette, October 2nd, 1750. Ran away from his master, William Brown of Framingham, on the 30th of September last, a mulatto fellow, about 27 years of age, named Crispus, 6 feet 2 inches high, short, curled hair, his knees nearer together than common, and had on light-colored beaver skin coat, plain brown fustian jacket, or brown, all wool, 1. New buckskin breeches, blue yarn stockings, and checked woolen shirt. Whoever will take up said runaway and convey him to his aforesaid master shall have 10 pounds old tenor reward, and all necessary charges paid. And all masters of vessels and others are hereby cautioned against concealing or carrying off said servant on penalty of the law. A descendant of D. Brown says of him, Crispus was well informed, and except in the instance referred to in the advertisement, was faithful to his master. He was a good judge of cattle and was allowed to buy and sell upon his own judgment of their value. He was fond of seafaring life, and probably with consent of his master was accustomed to take coasting voyages. The account of the time says he lately belonged to the New Providence, and was here in order to go to North Carolina. He was a huge bodily proportions, and brave almost to recklessness. John Adams, who defeated Captain Preston at his trial, says, Attucks was seen about 8 minutes before the firing at the head of 20 or 30 sailors in Cornhill, and had his hand a large cornwood stick. He was a stout fellow, whose very looks were enough to terrify any person. You hear that? They were scared of you. When he came down upon the soldiers by the sentry box, they pushed him off, but he cried out, Don't be afraid of them. They dare not fire. Kill them, knock them over. At the firing, he was killed instantly. 2 balls entering his breast. He was about 47 years old. Captain Preston was tried in October. And the 8 soldiers, December 8th, the defense was conducted by John Adams and Josiah Quincy Jr. The captain and 6 of the soldiers were acquitted, and 2, Matthew Kilroy and Hugh Montgomery, were brought in guilty of manslaughter, branded and sent to Castle Island. It says Attucks was born in Framingham. Town histories of Framingham written in 1847-1887 describe him as a slave of Deacon William Brown, though it is unclear whether Brown was his original owner. In 1750, Brown advertised for the return of a runaway slave. Crispus, we got that, right? In the advertisement, Brown describes Attucks and his clothing when he was last seen. And I wanted to get to this part right here. It's important. It says in 1874, an article in the American Historical Record, look it up people, by G. Bess Fisher, recounts a passage in the memoirs of Boston Tea Party participant George R.T. Hughes, which stated that at the time of the massacre, Attucks was a Nantucket Indian. At the time of the massacre, Attucks was a Nantucket Indian, not African, a Nantucket Indian. Now look what it says here. Though he is commonly described as an African American in popular culture, right? In popular culture. 2 major sources of eyewitness testimony about the massacre. 2 major sources of eyewitness about the massacre, both published in 1770, did not refer to Attucks as a black nor as a Negro, but rather as a mulatto and an Indian. A mulatto and an Indian. In an account from the Pennsylvania Gazette, a man who may have been Attucks was referred to as a mulatto man named Crispus, who was born in Framingham but lately belonged to the New Providence and was here in order to go forth from North Carolina. We already got the sources, right? However, during Attucks' time, mulatto was often used to describe skin tone rather than ethnicity. Again, during Attucks' time, we've already gone over this with Jack Forbes, right? I'm trying to tell you, they're just talking about light-skinned black person. And it says that at the time of Attucks, when he lived, that mulatto was often used to describe the skin tone rather than ethnicity, and sometimes referred to full-blooded Native Americans. All right, full-blooded Native Americans. First, the term mulatto was applied very loosely up to a late date. In 1834, the Marsh P. Indian case before the Massachusetts legislature, Honorable Charles Marston, one of the overseers, testified that Mr. Fish had a Sunday school principally composed of white children. He did not recollect ever seeing more than 8 colored children in it. There were more whites. The overseer paid the school mistress 7 and 6 pence a week, and she boards herself to an Indian who kept school in winter, was paid $12 and $19 a month. The whites who attend Mr. Fish's meeting never pay anything to him or to the church. When the tax is required, the people get rid of their tax by attending Mr. Fish's meeting. There was always twice as many whites as blacks in society. Last summer, 1833, he counted 18 colored persons, and twice that number of whites. Mr. Dwight, one of the committee, asked if so many whites being there did not tend to discourage the Indians from being interested in the meeting. Mr. Marston thought it might apes Indian nullification, Boston 1835, page 165. Here the terms colored persons, blacks, and Indians are synonymous. They all mean Marshpee Indians. Again, you can find this in Ape's Indian Nullification from Boston 1835 on page 165. You listening? That here the terms colored persons, blacks, and Indians are synonymous. They are all mean Marshpee Indians. When they're saying black and Indian and colored, they're just talking about the Marshpee Indians in these records. All right. So again, before I continue with that article, I want you to see what they mean. So again, in the book they're referring to called the Indian Nullification of the Unconstitutional Laws of Massachusetts relative to the Mashpee tribe. So this book is all about Mashpee tribe Indians. But what he's saying is you're gonna see the word colored, black, and Negro, I believe, and it's all synonymous, or Indian synonymous to the Mashpee Indians. All right. For example, all right, let's go to page 25 here. Again, page 25, it says, we're talking about the Marshpee Indians, right? It says, leaving Marshpee for New Bedford, I preached at several places on my way and delivered lectures on Indian affairs. Many of the advocates of oppression became clamorous on hearing the truth from a simple Indian's lips, and a strong excitement took place in that quarter. Some feared that an insurrection might break out among the colored people. They're talking about, again, the Mashpee Indians, colored people. All right, in which blood might be shed. Some called me an impostor, and others approved of my proceedings, especially the Quakers, whom I ever found benevolent and ready to help us. Their generous goodwill toward colored people of all races is well known. Page 43, it says, this is not an excuse, however, for the government of this commonwealth, whose duty it was to see that its red children were not abused in this way. Red, right, copper-colored. We greatly fear that our white fathers did not much care about their colored children and Marshpee. Again, colored children in Marshpee. We're talking about the Marshpee Indians. On page 56 of this book, it says, O ye who despise Indians merely because they are poor, ignorant, and copper-colored. Again, only because they are Negro, you despise. What happened to the so-called Negro, right? What did you fight for in the 60s, right? You were being discriminated, you were being despised just because you were Negro. All right, and it says here, O ye who despise Indians merely because they are poor, ignorant, and copper-colored tribes of America. Do you not think that God will have respect unto them? And this is in reference to what the American Historical Record was talking about in this book. It says on page 108, and Mr. Fish now has but 5 colored members of his church. So they're talking about Mashpee Indians, not talking about an African American. All right, remember that. And of the 5 colored persons, but 1 is male, and he has recently signed a paper saying he has been deceived by Mr. Fish's petition. All right, so these are Mashpee Indians, and records here being called colored. All right, what did it call you? Colored, right?
I came from what you might call 2 cultures. Although I went to a purely white school, my schooling on the other side was through my elders. Now, for example, I was fully aware that we as a people could not talk our language. If we were, and we were convicted of it, the authorities could take our tongues. Could be in meetings. The only place that we could meet without interference was at the Indian Church and Meeting House. And there we got around that and did our tribal business, because instead of having a tribal council, we had a church council. Instead of, say, a chief, you had a deacon. Instead of a medicine man, say, a prophet.
So again, we're turning to the American Historical Record here. And this book, again, it said that in the book Indians Nullification, right, the one we just came from, that the terms colored persons, blacks, and Indians are synonymous. They all mean Marshpee Indians. Okay, so let's continue here. It says, in 1763, Marshpee was incorporated as a district in words as follows. Be it enacted and that all lands belonging to the Indians and mulattoes. In Marshby, this seems to be alliterative law, pharsaliology covering a people by the names by which they were usually known. Again, in the trial, Boston, 1824, to show that the terms mulatto and Indian were synonymously used, see examination of Ebenezer, Brigham, and Samuel Quincy for the Crown, page 9. All right, you see that? So mulatto Indians were being called mulatto, all right, basically with no African in them. Question: did you see a mulatto among the persons who surrounded the soldiers? Answer: I did not observe. Question: did they seem to be sailors or townsmen? Answer: they were dressed, some of them, in habits of sailors. Oh, we got this in the other book, right? The third witness after this is Lanford. Question: did you know the Indian who was killed? Answer: no, there was an Indian there, right? We're talking about Crispus Attucks. Did you see anybody press on the soldiers with a cordwood stick? Answer: no. Both these questions refer to Attucks. Again, Attucks. He was the Indian who was called the same day both Indian and mulatto. So he was referred to as Indian and mulatto in the same day, right? Thus it seems that Brewer, who called Attucks the mulatto fellow in 1770, was justified by an act of incorporation which called Indians mulattoes in 1760. You hear that? And in the absence of other testimony, such evidence does not in the least prove him to be of African origin. But we have direct testimony. Mr. George T. Hughes, one of the famous Boston Tea Party, published his reminiscence in New York in 1835. On page 103, he says, Mr. Pierce remembers Attucks distinctly, though he never saw him before. Attucks also, who he says was a Nantucket Indian. He was a Nantucket Indian belonging on board a whale ship. So we go to the source in this book called The Traits of the Tea Party, being a memoir of George R.T. Hughes, one of the last of its survivors, with a history of that transaction, reminiscence of the massacre and the siege, and other stories of old time. Again, this is one of the guys who threw the tea over in the Boston Harbor that caused the whole Boston Massacre. All right, it says here by Bostonian in 1835. All right, we're going to go to page 102. Down here in the bottom, it says the street began to be noisy. Fire was cried in varied quarters. Some of the engines turned out. The people came rushing in, many of them armed with sticks and stakes wrenched out on the stalls, in the market and elsewhere. In large proportion of them, undoubtedly as much disposed to enjoy a row as the soldiers themselves. Attucks, a colored man, again, Attucks, the colored man, right? First, he's colored man. Now, on the next page, talks about how he was basically, well, it says here, according to all accounts, figured pretty largely among them. Says that he was seen there. People were seeing him supposedly leading the mob. Only some 10 minutes before that event, one of the witnesses at least swore that he saw him at the head of 20 or 30 sailors in Cornhill with a cordwood stick in his hand. Mr. Pierce, who stood about this time at the corner of Royal Exchange Lane, now Exchange Street, and King Street, where the sentinel was on guard in front of the King's Custom House, remembers Attucks distinctly, though he never saw him before. He remembers also that he had a large stick in his hand, and that he saw him early in this tumult harassing and abusing the sentry, poking him rather severely with the stick and calling him a lobster, a popular reproach, and swearing that he would have off one of his claws. Pierce thought the soldier would hurt him and advised him to refrain. Attucks, now listen to this, also, who he says was a Nantucket Indian. Again, he's saying Attucks again. First, they're letting us know down on this side that Attucks, the colored man, right? Now, Attucks, also, who he says was a Nantucket Indian belonging on board a whale ship of Mr. Folger's, then in the harbor, and he remembers distinctly the peculiar noise of a frightful war whoop which he yelled. This Attucks he cautioned to keep off and be careful. He declined, however, though he crawled back a little, muttering and still swearing he would have one of his claws off. Mr. Adams, in his subsequent defense of the soldiers, seems to refer to some of these circumstances when he describes the multitude shouting and hustling, threatening life, the bells ringing, the mob whistling and screaming like an Indian yell. Again, like an Indian yell, the people from all quarters throwing every species of rubbish they could pick up in the street. This is a strong coloring and is applied to the scene which immediately followed the arrival of the soldiery from the main guard to relieve the sentry. Attucks. Adams again says this Attucks appears to have undertaken to be the hero of the night and to lead this army with banners to form them in the first place in Dock Square and march them up the King Street with their clubs. Bailey, a witness, says, I saw a number of men going up Cornhill, and the mulatto fellow headed them in number between 20 and 30. They appeared to be sailors. Again, Attucks, who he says was a Nantucket Indian. He's an Indian. There's more records of him being referred to or being linked with American native than an African. As Mr. Pierce remembers Attucks distinctly, though he never saw him before. Attucks also, who he says was a Nantucket Indian. He was a Nantucket Indian belonging on board a whale ship. Biographer Mitch Catchum, as well as multiple 19th century Framingham town histories, have drawn a connection between Attucks and John Attuck of Framingham, a Narragansett man who was hanged in Framingham in 1776 during King Philip's War. The word for there in the Narragansett language is Attuck. Catchum also noted a possible connection to a probable Natick woman and possible Attuck's mother or relative named Nanny Peter Attucks, so both sides, right? Who is described as a Negro woman. Again, look what's going on. They're telling us that they have records of a Natick woman, a Natick tribal woman, possible Attucks' mother or relative named Nanny Peter Attucks was described as a Negro woman. All right, this is a whole different story, but it relates to what we're talking about. It's related to Crispus Attucks. You see how they're just changing American Aboriginals into Negro or Black or African Americans, right? With no real proof. There is a bigger history. There is a recorded history. There's another story being told. If you really read the sources in the books and put it all together like we're doing right now. It says here in the book, Peter Attucks Jacob. It says here was a he worked for Colonel Joshua Buckminster in Framingham, 1730. Nanny, May 19, 1737. Prince Yongi, probably descendant of John Attuck, the Indian who lived in the east of the state of Muster Grounds. Alright, so it says that a Natick woman and possible Attuck's mother or relative named Nancy Peter Attucks was described as a Negro woman in 1747 estate inventory of Framingham slaveholder Joseph Buckminster, and along with Jacob Peter Attucks as probable descendant of John Attuck the Indian in an 1847 history of Framingham. Alright, we have progressed thus far. Attucks was a sailor and the leader of a mob of sailors. Now first, for two questions to analyze. Was it dramatically probable that Attucks was a Negro in, at that time, slaveholding Massachusetts, that he should have been the leader of a mob of sailors? The Negro at that time in Massachusetts was in the usual servile social abasement that attends slavery. So he's saying he couldn't be a Negro because he would be enslaved. He wouldn't be having these roles that Crispus Attucks played in the Revolutionary War and the Boston Massacre. In view of dramatic properties of time and place, I do not think if Attucks had been a Negro that he could have been, in the words of John Adams, on the 5th of March 1770, the hero of the night, leading his army with banners formed in Dock Squares up to King Street. His social status would have been such that the probabilities are against it. As an Indian, however, it would be different. Crispus Attucks might in character be the leader of an affray or the inaugurator of a revolution. As an Indian, this is possible. A fact or two will serve to demonstrate my position. While at that time in Massachusetts, the Negro occupied the most servile position, the Indian occupied one of almost social equality with the white population. You hear that? In the office of the Secretary of State in Massachusetts will be found a muster roll containing a return of men enlisted in the 1st Regiment of Continental Troops in the county of Barnstable for 3 years and during the war in Colonel Bradford's regiment. commencing in 1777. Among these volunteers are the names of 26 Marshpee Indians. The whole number drawn from the county of Barnstable numbered but 149 men, nearly one-fifth of whom were volunteers from the little Indian plantation of Marshpee, which then did not contain more than 100 male heads of families. These Indian soldiers fought during the war, and as far as can be ascertained from documents or tradition, all but one fell martyrs to liberty. In the struggle for independence, there was in 1835 but one Indian living among who received a pension for his services as a revolutionary soldier in Marshpee, old Isaac Wickham. You see the name Isaac, right? Hebrew, Wickham. And he was not in Bradford Regiment. Parson Hawley, in a memorial to the legislature in 1783, states that most of the women in Marshpee had lost their husbands during the war. At that time, there were 70 widows at one plantation. Such were the Massachusetts Indians during the Revolutionary War. We can realize that Crispus Attucks, a gigantic specimen of such a race, could lead the crowd that came whistling, screaming, and rending like an Indian yell up King Street on the 5th of March, 1770. I have every reason to believe that the Negro makes a good sailor, and there is no reason why Crispus Attucks might not have been a Negro and a sailor on board Captain Folger's whale ship. We also know that the Massachusetts Indians were a nautical people, and they were, and have been and are still employed on whaling voyages. And you're also going to find the history of Cape Verdeans as whalers as well, and they're from that region. A lot of the ancestry of Cape Verdeans go back many generations in Boston and on New Bedford and all these places, Providence. So as you can see, the Native Americans also have a history of whaling voyages in New England. A writer in the Boston Advocate in 1833 says, "I am informed that many of our stoutest whalers are produced among our small Indian tribes." Abe says on page 78, "Sometimes an Indian bound on a whaling voyage would earn $400 or $500, and the shipmaster would account to the overseer for the whole sum." To this day, the remnants of some of these tribes are sailors, and I am told the Gayhead Indians are renowned as boat steerers and harpooners, very responsible positions also, so that Crispus Attucks as a sailor was at any rate as likely to be an Indian as a Negro, and much more likely to be the leader of a party of sailors. Upon this hint, I examined Barry's History of Framingham. On page 64, I find a note relating the marriage of Prince Yong, a Negro, in 1737 to Nancy Peter Attucks of Framingham. The name says Mr. Barry, indicating Indian extraction. Attucks. We will refer to that again. In 1764-65, the number of Negroes in Framingham is given at 25. Had Crispus Attucks been among them, I am certain the Reverend historian would have found it out. The native Indians appear to have been the primitive occupants of the town. In 1676, John Otok, his wife and children were condemned for participating in King Philip's war. The lives of the women and children were spared, so he was framed. Remember, we read that. It does not seem clear whether John Attuck, query Attucks, was executed or not, and he was executed, we read before. Roger Williams, in his Key into the Language of America, defines Attucks, deer, cotton, vocabulary of the Massachusetts or Natick Indian language, defines Attuck a deer. Eliot's Bible, same language, Natick or Massachusetts, deer, Attuck, Song of Solomon. The surname Attucks, and then evidently an Indian, a Natick Indian, and not a Negro surname. Again, the name Attucks is then evidently an Indian, a Natick Indian, and not a Negro surname. All right, and you got this name, the Shattuck, as well here in all this region, most likely Aboriginal last name or Aboriginal people. Prince Younger has been posited as the father of Attucks. However, Younger did not arrive in Massachusetts until the mid-1720s after Attucks was born, and did not marry Nanny Peter Attucks until 1737, after which point they had children, who are noted in multiple histories, but among whom Crispus is not mentioned, a son who died young, and Phoebe, who never married. Neither Phoebe nor the son are recorded with the Attucks or Peter Attucks surname. All right. All right, so hope you're following along. I want to show you something here. Again, we're returning to the books called A History of Framingham, Massachusetts, early known as Danvers Farms from 1640 to 1880, with a genealogical register from J.H. Temple, 1887. Now, again, they're saying that Crispus Attucks is half African or mulatto because his dad is African or African American. And again, and Wikipedia told us that there is no record of him having a son named Crispus. Really, so let's read what it says in the actual account. It says a noted character of the class under consideration was Prince, sometimes called Prince Young, but whose name is recorded as Prince Youngi and Prince Jonah, by which last name he is noticed in the town records in 1767. He was brought from Africa when about 25 years old, having been a person of consideration in his native land, from which circumstance perhaps he received his name. He was bought by Colonel Joseph Buckminster, Jr., and was afterwards owned by his son D. Thomas Buckminster. He married in 1737 Nanny Peter Attucks, a Natick tribal woman, remember, of Framingham, by whom he had several children, among them a son who died young, and a daughter, Phoebe, who never married. Again, Crispus Attucks was born in 1723. Around that time, they're saying that his father is Prince Younger, but we know that he didn't marry Nancy Attucks until 1737, and there's no mention of him being his dad in any records of these historical places of Framingham or anything like that. All right, that's why I wanted to show you guys this. This is what they do in mass. How they hijack everything and just start labeling everybody African American or Negro or Black. Now, I claim that Crispus Attucks was a native Indian from Framingham, a sailor employed on a whale ship of Captain Folgers from Nantucket, then lying on 5th March 1770 in Boston Harbor. It may be argued that Attucks was a half-breed Indian, part Negro. This is possible, but I have found no proof of such a fact. Again, I have found no proof of such a fact, and I haven't either. The fact of Folger's ship being in Boston Harbor is a matter of record, and that record which I have not seen may settle the question of his nationality. The town records of Framingham may throw some additional light on the question that may prove my error, but until such further development is made, he stands as a native Indian from Framingham. All right? Have anybody been able to disprove this? I'm sorry. Has anybody been able to this day? I'm talking about right now, 2018. This is a native Indian from Framingham, Crispus Attucks. They telling you he's African American. With his native Indian name, his occupation dramatically in character, a sailor, and a leader of sailors, and the hero of this opening affray that led to American independence and a rapidly approaching continental empire.
I have a power backing me that the government of the United States does not have. That's why I can speak truth to power and never shake. Because what is behind me, I will introduce you to that. You all will know that a man of God has been in your midst. And every word that I say, you're gonna mean it. And if you reject the truth, and want to stay a fearful coward, a lake of fire for the fearful and the cowardly. A lot of you have listened to my show, and a lot of you have criticized me. But when the truth unfolds, when the Creator's truth unfolds, then you'll see that this is not a game that I play. I serve warning to all of you that will continue to